Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers, and it's program number 740, February the 10th, 1986. There are so many stories in the news, it's impossible to keep up and update the material that is pouring out, literally pouring out from all areas that I've discussed with you for the past many years on the air. But for the next few weeks, I'm going to be zeroing in very closely into the space shuttle explosion, who I think is behind it, and the meaning of that event, and how it's going to affect our lives in the future, and also the area of advanced genetic sciences, the company that wants to put altered genetic bacteria into Monterey County and to a lot of other places in the world. They want to develop a multi-billion-dollar industry out of it, and the effects that will have upon us and our immune system and the weather, the effects upon the climate. And I will be detailing those and putting a lot of other material aside for a while. The United States had a military coup, this is my firm belief, November 22nd, 1963, and the continuous development of the people involved in the murder or in the cover-up of John Kennedy seemed to be emerging, just as the play The Serpent's Egg illustrates, this visible sac where the serpent emerges after a long period of gestation. And now the fruit of their efforts is really apparent if you look very closely at what is happening. I will make just a couple of announcements first before I get to the space shuttle. I want to give you the address of a taping company that does the broadcast, the special series with David Emory and Nip Tuck on KFJC. They're in Mountain View, California, 1300D Space Park Way, just like it sounds, 2 words, Space Park Way, Mountain View, California, 94043. The company is called DAVCORE, D-A-V-K-O-R-E. And send for a list of tapes that are available. There are series on the assassination of John Kennedy. These are long 90-minute tapes, cassettes, in-depth studies on Vietnam and Watergate, Nazi connections, and they've done a lot of archive series on the hidden history of the Cold War, Part 1, hidden history of the Cold War, Part 2, Reinhard Gehlen and his organization, Frank Churchill, Edwin Wilson, and terrorism coming from the right, not the left kind that we hear about all the time. They have broadcasts on mind control, a lot of those interviews with Joe Holsinger regarding Jonestown Massacre, a series on the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, several series on the Aryan nations and their links to the John Birch Society, to the Philippines, to the extreme right wing going right back to Germany and the Kriegs Academy in Germany. And now they're doing a series of broadcasts on the World Anti-Communist League. These are very important in their in-depth studies that take a different pace than the usual newspaper items weekly that they do every week on the air. These are carefully studied once-a-month series that should belong to your library of tape-recorded discussions of events that have taken place that have altered our society so many ways. About a year ago, I talked about a book called on psychiatric genocide, rather. The book is called Mass Murderers in White Coats, Psychiatric Genocide in Nazi Germany and the United States. That book has been sent to people who ordered it before. Lenny Lappin is the author of the book. You can order more of those. I'll put on the sheet that accompanies this broadcast the address of where you can get this book. And it's $9, and mine just came. It's a very good book and should be part of your collection of things that are happening in this country that were brought over from Germany or worked in conjunction with Germany that are affecting our lives at that level. Now, when Jimmy Carter was president, we saw the Shah of Iran moved out of that country. He was put in when Mr. Mossadegh was murdered by the CIA. He was the choice of the United States government and the powers that be, and he was kicked out. You know what happened to the Shah. Somoza was the choice of the United States government and the powers that be, and he was kicked out of Nicaragua. This was when Jimmy Carter was president, and 2 American puppets were allowed to fall because there really wasn't much way to hold them up any longer. Now, Ronald Reagan is president of the United States, and you see the Philippines is in total disarray. Another connection to the fascist puppet that the United States put in and selected, President Ferdinand Marcos. And Papa Doc has left Haiti in a United States airplane. Mr. Duvalier had been a dictator since his early childhood. I guess he learned from his daddy. And interestingly enough, those bones were dug up of Papa Duvalier this past week and spread around. The grave was dug up. That was the first thing that happened during the coup. So the anger against those people in that family, the American puppets, again paid by the Americans, is being expressed quite thoroughly on the streets of Haiti, where they're celebrating now. The carnival in Brazil is taking place this week, and there's been quite a few references on television to the floats, to the anti-Americanism, to the fact that it's the first time in 21 years that they've been without a military dictatorship. That was a dictatorship put in the CIA just within months of when John Kennedy was murdered in 1964. They finally unloaded their dictatorship, and there are anti-American floats in Brazil and a certain freedom that even the conservative news people are calling attention to and can't help but avoid. They can't avoid the fact that the lid of oppression has been somewhat loosened. The escape valve and the gas and poisons are able to seep out. So even in this religious and generally social event, the carnival down there, they are expressing their political feelings out on the streets. So the next chapter in American foreign policy will have to be Mr. Pinochet, and hopefully someday he will be hanging by his ankles like Mussolini and then thrown out to the streets and burned for what he is. And the American foreign policy is in total disarray. I think it's becoming obvious to people all over the world what the United States has stood for, where we put our money, who we put into office, and one by one, the violence is becoming so obvious, and our supported people are becoming so bad, noticeably, even by the mass media, that something is happening in these various countries. Now, I haven't had time to update the chapter of what is happening to newspaper people who are dying very young and mysteriously, politically of the left, most of them, some I'm not sure of, but having mysterious deaths. And the media is the way by which we get our information of the world, good, bad, or otherwise. We depend on the media. And there have been a lot of untimely deaths. A UPI editor in New York was struck and killed. He was 52 years old, crossing 42nd Street, hit by an automobile, and he died. But there was one article in the San Jose Mercury that caught my attention that goes into the newspaper early deaths, a columnist, but there was a name in here that was familiar to most of you who listen to World Watchers. So I want to tell you about this one. The person who died is David Pickoff, P-I-C-K-O-F-F, 56 years old, Associated Press photographer. The location is New York. David Pickoff, a photographer with the AP for more than 26 years and president of the New York Press Photographers Association from 1975 to 85, died yesterday of a heart attack. Pickoff was stricken in the AP's office that he had covered since 1959, including assignments from City Hall, which would be plenty of mafia trials, I suppose, going on now, the United Nations, and Spot News. Okay, now the article goes on, just a brief obit. David Pickoff exhibited the highest level of professionalism, and this is a quotation about the man who's describing his contributions and dedications that will be missed, and it is said by Harold G. Buell, B-U-E-L-L, AP's Assistant General Manager for News Photographs. Now, I've had his name on the air for 3 years with the question of, and the allegations, that Mr. Harold Buell has been the courier of money from Klaus Barbie to Zurich, Switzerland, to the account of Joseph Mengele. I've never seen his name in the news, and he has an uncle in the State Department that works with Fritz Kraemer, and of course that then goes down, seeps to Henry Kissinger and the whole gang that I keep bringing up or don't bring up often enough because a lot of other news. Harold G. Buell's name just happens to be in the paper with this obit. The Klaus Barbie trial is held up. This is going into the third year. DeLorean's missing money. That trial is supposed to begin in April. They keep putting that off on where the missing money is. And the Joseph Mengele case, I'll update with you hopefully next week, but I have too much to do this week on the search for Mengele Jack Anderson has a lot of articles, just 3 recently, on the fact that he believes Joseph Mengele is alive, and I have a lot to share with you on that. So Mengele, Barbie, and DeLorean, that triad that I've been bringing up for the past 3 years, isn't dead, and Hal Buell's name just happens to be in the newspaper this week. And speaking of assault on news, there are other ways besides killing newsmen that is taking place. Many of you might have seen the New York Times article, January 31st, 1986, news groups protesting NASA's seizing of film. There were over 800 journalists down in Florida to watch the takeoff of the shuttle, the Challenger, because of this supposed first she was the first teacher in school, but she wasn't the first ordinary citizen. That was a hype and a lie. They've had scientists and other citizens from Germany and from Saudi Arabia, and she wasn't the first one at all. They don't care what they say to promote this thing, but there were over 800 newspaper people there, and as soon as the space shuttle blew up, all of the cameras were impounded and all the film was taken away, and NASA took their cameras, and the various people from United Press and news agencies are complaining. They said, we had people sitting at their video terminals in tears working on the story, and wouldn't it be a shame if somehow this national tragedy was worsened by the creation of a diversionary sideshow between NASA and the press. Diversionary sideshow. Don't take that word lightly. We have to say, well, what is the diversionary sideshow? This was one complaint. Then the article goes on to say, a NASA spokesman said Wednesday that the agency knew that impounding the film might be illegal because it's not the agency's property, but they were going to do it anyway. They were keeping the film of everything that was taken down there in Florida when the space shuttle was launched, and the film is being kept by NASA, and the men can only, or women can only have their cameras if they release the film. The New York Times, represented by Mr. A.M. Rosenthal, the executive editor, was complaining. He said, we're willing to let them have it, but the impounding is horrendous, and they took our film without consent, which establishes a very dangerous precedent that we must protest, and you better believe they should. NASA spokesman said the agency was overwhelmed with requests for information, and they're unwilling to speculate on what has happened, but the spokesman said that people whom journalists want to interview are involved in the investigation of the disaster, and giving interviews would delay or distort their work, which in essence means that you newspaper people will make it longer for us to put a lid on what happened. You will delay our work, and you may give out some facts, just as they did at Dealey Plaza at the time Kennedy was killed, which would distort the work of the Warren Commission. So they are worried now about the distortion of the news media, or that they will delay their conclusions. Now, after the first day of public hearings, and I'll do quite a bit about the select group that have been hired, they're identical to the Warren Commission, to cover this up. The very first day, they already have acknowledged perjury, outright lies, or giving it another title, a little more selective title, but it is still perjury. They are saying that there are discrepancies, but that's because of lack of familiarity by top NASA officials on the details of the problems, particularly regarding the seals. So the outright lies are charged as discrepancies. In another court, they would be perjury, and they were under oath. And then the very first day, they went public for one sole purpose, and that was to exclude the weather. The news report, CNN, covered the hearings, and I saw them, taped them, and then at the end of the day, they said the weather was not a factor, and the announcer said that, and this wasn't the absolute conclusion of the group, but that's what they wanted you to know. And then NBC and CBS and all the other news media said that the commission investigating the space shuttle explosion came to the conclusion that weather wasn't a factor. And as I told you last week on World Watchers, weather is a factor, and weather is the secret word that is to be left out of these hearings, because it will then go to who gave the orders to launch the ship, knowing weather was a factor. The who is important, and just an educated guess at this point, Not different than last week, it was Ronald Reagan and the Air Force and the Pentagon. The Pentagon said fly. That will be the ultimate bottom line. You may not see it for 8 or 10 years. Now, this morning's paper has a story. NASA was warned of a hazard. The shuttle probe focuses on safety seals flaws. And evidently the commission and Mr. Rogers allegedly were furious because they were told by NASA that these seals were no problem. They weren't aware of any problem. And it turned out that the New York Times published articles that they were aware of the seals around the rockets, booster rockets, causing a problem. And they hadn't told them the truth at the very first day of the hearings. They were told something different and had to read it from the New York Times. The San Francisco Chronicle has a story. The commission investigating the explosion of the shuttle Challenger asked NASA to produce all records relating to problems involving safety seals on the booster rockets. They were the article went on, they were angry that the New York Times reported this story and that NASA was warned in July of 1985 that the failure of seals, which are designed to protect flames from bursting through the scams where segments of the booster rockets are joined, would certainly be catastrophic. NASA officials said they suspect a rupture near a seam in the right side solid fuel booster rocket may have been one of the primary causes of the explosion that killed 7 astronauts on January the 28th. NASA's internal documents indicate that the charring and erosion of the seals, known as the O-rings, had caused concern among agency engineers and analysts. One engineer's memorandum cited 17 instances in which the primary O-rings were eroded in flight, and at least one instance where the backup O-ring, the last barrier protecting the seam between segments of the rocket outer casing from the rocket's gases, had been eroded. And there was another memorandum saying that flight safety had been and still compromised by potential failure of the seals. Failure during launch could be catastrophic. So the question is, why did they go? Why did they leave, knowing that they had this memorandum? And I'm going to tell you, I believe that they wanted it to go. They didn't care, and it did what they had planned it to do. It was not taken care of for reasons that I believe are sabotage from the inside. William Graham said that the plume appeared to emerge from an area near a seam joining the 2 bottom segments of the right-hand rocket booster. And he said NASA had not established whether the plume occurred at the seam or just near the seam. You don't have to be far from the seam. San Jose Mercury, February the 7th, 1986, combines the large rubber O-rings that they're talking about now, that were written in NASA memos in 1985 in July, and combines them with the fact of sub-freezing temperature. Now, that is what's supposed to be left out of these hearings. They told you the first day, don't talk about temperature, and that's why I think the cameras were impounded, so you wouldn't see the icicles. The San Jose Mercury story says the night before Challenger's launch, space agency officials were concerned about sub-freezing temperatures. The sub-freezing temperature might cause a seal to crack and open in one of the solid fuel booster rockets. Officials feared the cold might have robbed special large rubber O-rings of their ability to seal between the stacked cylindrical segments of which a booster is made. Without a pressure-tight seal, the rocket's hot exhaust gases could seep out the rupture. Films show a plume, and this is what they're referring to in the New York Times story and in the San Francisco Chronicle today and other papers around the country. Film shows a plume, a white-hot flame escaping from the rupture in the casing of its right hand of starboard solid fuel booster. A leading theory holds the plume caused the explosion, 16 seconds later blowtorching the nearby tank of liquid oxygen. Aside from the effect of rubber seals, cold weather has other adverse effects on the rocket in addition to the O-rings. When solid fuel gets too cold, it forms cracks that will allow burning to reach the inner walls of the casing. Just before launch, Rockwell expressed concern about the ice both on the Challenger and on the launch tower. there was concern that chunks of dislodged ice would knock loose some of the shuttle's heat shielding tiles needed during re-entry. Judge Judson A. Lovingood, and many of you might have seen him on CNN testifying just several days ago. He's deputy manager of shuttle projects at Marshall Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama, said in quotes, "After consulting with experts from Morton Thiekol Corporation, which makes the booster, it was decided that the temperature was not a problem." And later I'll go into detail with you and update the story of the temperature. I've taken every article I could from 10 newspapers this past week and magazines and broken them down to every one that discusses temperature and the effect of the temperature. He goes on to say Thiekol recommended to launch, and it is Thiekol that knew that the seams would not hold if there was sub-freezing temperature. The Senator Mercury said Judson Lovingood testified under oath that Thiekol said it was okay to go. And today's paper said that there was a little discrepancy between their documents and what he said. Commission members asked some specific questions only to get vague answers, and the first thing the commission did, the reason they went public, was that they wanted to throw out the ice because flying in that temperature, flying or leaving off the shuttle, if you call it flying or taking off, was dangerous, according to all the accounts I've read, with the ice. And again, you have to ask the question, then why did they take the chance? The San Jose Mercury article goes on. Morton Thiekol, the fuels manufacturer, said it was designed to withstand down to Fahrenheit 40 degrees. The night before the launch, January 27th, the air temperature was in the 20s. Judson said that the fuel itself doesn't drop below 55 degrees, but then went on to say there are no thermometers in the fuel. Its temperature could be calculated from the booster's thermal properties and surrounding air temperatures, and another article went on to say they didn't bother to do that. So the question is, if they were concerned for 3 days about the freezing temperature, if the shuttle couldn't launch last year because of temperature that wasn't this low, if a shuttle couldn't enter in this kind of cold temperature and had to be put off and go to another area because of the cold, if all of this talk is going on about temperature until the launch takes place, they're talking about ice, they're talking about fuel and damage to the seams, then it is important to ask why they went and who ordered it. I repeat that again. Now, an article in the San Jose Mercury, the same one, says, as if to emphasize the panel's eagerness to win public confidence. This is the commission appointed by Ronald Reagan. This is Reagan's Warren Commission with Mr. Rogers, and I'll do more on him in a little bit, probably next week. As if to emphasize the panel's eagerness to win public acceptance and confidence and to proceed quickly, the hearing was held in public Thursday, February the 6th, just one day after the newly appointed members met for the first time. Other hearings will be closed. This is, George Will gave a statement that I had on the air when the Korean airline went down, that if you capture the mind of people early and lock in an idea, you can hold them to that idea. And in this case, they want you to hold to the idea that the weather was not a factor. The commission met for one day, and then it was repeated over and over, weather isn't a factor. That was last week. This week, it's the seals, but they've separated the seals from the weather factor. So as this story evolves, keep in mind the weather. Now, I've made some pretty harsh allegations about what I think happened, and I'm going to quickly run through for you the reasons I believe it was purposely sabotaged, and then I'll do more of them in detail later, but just to give you the reasons. Historically and in chronological order, March 23, 1983, Ronald Reagan met with Edward Teller to present the Star Wars speech to Congress and to the world, which was to change the entire direction of the United States to a first strike capability for World War III. Edward Teller has helped Ronald Reagan with that since Reagan was governor of California, and they pushed this on to the people March 23, 1983. Edward Teller is also, he's on the board of Western Goals. The late Larry McDonald, who went down in the Korean airline, was a board member and was chairman of Western Goals. In August of 1983, August 30th, the shuttle Challenger worked with the Korean airline 007 using a civilian flight to cover their experimentations, and the shuttle surfaced 3 times over the Challenger, over the KAL, where Larry McDonald was flying, and soon to be Deep Six. It was a Boeing 747 that went down that did not malfunction in directions, and so this plane went down, and it worked with the Challenger. So there was the Star Wars in conjunction with the Challenger that took place just several months after Reagan's speech. The speech was in March. The Challenger and Larry McDonald were in activity, one later in activity, August 1983. In September 1983, September the 18th, the New York Times has a story by John Noble Wilford saying now the space shuttle is going to move from exploration to military. It was military 1 month before, and this article just couldn't have been written. Those magazine sections are written way ahead of time, and he was referring to the spaceship Challenger in this article so that the shift from discovery of the universe to military was officially declared, and the structure of Star Wars versus NASA's exploratory purposes were soon to be defined and came to a head with the explosion of the Challenger. So at this stage, there was this Defense Department, Star Wars, beginning to take over the space program with a military action, and it involved the spaceship, as I say, spaceship Challenger. The Challenger has gone down, Larry McDonald's gone down, and there are other relationships to this event that tangle together in ways that I'll define for you later. I think first I'll just give you the reasons why I think this was sabotaged, and then some more of the characters involved, like Mr. Rogers and Henry Kissinger and Henry Jackson, the late Henry Jackson, and NASA and Alexander Haig, and the cast of characters that are webbing into this situation. Now, briefly, as I say, these are the reasons I believe the space shuttle was allowed to blow up, and there are approximately, so far, I have 28 reasons, so I'll just run through them now and for the second half of this broadcast, and then develop them later, certain aspects of them. Number one, they could have taken off on Sunday afternoon. The weather was clear. There was no problem. They didn't take advantage of the weather, and they knew a cold front was coming on Monday. And keep in mind that they knew that the seals could be affected by cold, and they knew that the seals could cause a catastrophe. They could have taken off Sunday afternoon. The reason they didn't, and that's another side story, is that there were over 700, possibly 800 news people at the Space Center in Florida, and it was the same day as the Super Bowl. And I'll go into the politics of the Super Bowl, the astronauts, and Krista herself from Boston pushing for that other team, and the news people hoping to watch the Super Bowl. If that sounds horrendous, pardon me, but it was the takeoff day was Super Bowl day, and there are 800 photographers down there. It could have taken off. The weather was clear, and it didn't. And they knew that cold was coming, and cold was a danger, but they took a chance on Monday morning. The second point is, were the delays necessary Monday, in taking off? They had what they called a series of, pardon the expression, comic events, sort of as funny as the men at the Watergate. Remember, they thought they were funny breaking in the Watergate Hotel. They had trouble with screws and bolts. The bolts they couldn't take out. They had to use an axe to chop away at some ice to get in it. They had drills with no batteries. They didn't have the right instruments. They kept sending back to wherever you get your instruments for 3 hours on Monday. They were supposed to put this thing together and get off, and they were doing jobs and sawing through and sanding and fixing parts of the space shuttle that were absolutely ridiculous, and I don't believe they were necessary. The third point is that Challenger was a loser and had major problems from every flight. And if you haven't seen it in your newspapers, we'll run down those points later. It was a big risk in sending it again. It almost went down the night of the Korean airline. It had such trouble with the rocket boosters. This is a plane that had 7 major problems that could go to the boneyard, or you could throw it away, whichever you want. But if you throw it away and got rid of civilians in space at the same time and said from now on only military, it would have a very powerful effect. And you could also test things like possibly lasers that could blow up the rocket boosters, similar to the way that the Vandenberg Air Force Base was testing lasers and blew down one of our own satellites that was put up there for peaceful purposes. So the Challenger this ship was the run to the litter. It never was any good. It was always trouble. So fourth reason would be to get civilians out of space. The first thing we heard was leave it to the military and proceed. And if you get the civilians out, you keep the secrets to yourself and let's not fly them. And the fifth thing is that they loaded a ship that wasn't good, and they knew the SEALs couldn't take the cold, and they waited till the cold when they could have left on a sunny day. And they put in their rainbow bunch of astronauts, the Buddhist that I mentioned before, the Japanese, the two women, one of them a Jew, the other the teacher that Reagan pushed on them, and the black scientist. So they had the Rainbow Coalition that went into the sunset or to the pot of gold, whichever way you want to say it. I'll take a 1-minute break and come back to the reasons. I think the ship was sabotaged. I'm up to number 5. So 4, we have 13 more to go. This is Mae Brussell. It's side 2 of broadcast number 470. And in case you picked it up in the middle, I'm talking about the reasons that I believe the space shuttle was sabotaged, that it is a continuous process from the coup we had in Dallas in 1963, and that this is the intrusion now into the Air Force, the Pentagon, and the military to solidify their base in the space program and to push the NASA officials aside, use the bulk of the money for Star Wars and for those people that will be involved in warfare projects up in space. Now, the sixth reason that I think something suspicious is the infighting between William Graham, who's now the acting chairman of the NASA group, and James Beggs, B-E-G-G-S, the former director. Mr. Beggs was just charged several weeks ago with influence and improper billing or receiving extra money for contracts with General Dynamics. And they go back to 1981. That was 5 years ago that this problem was noticed. And 5 years later, they're prosecuting these people. He's been in a high position all this time, and Mr. Beggs is one of those that wanted and worked for space stations. Now, there are two conflicts going on at the present time. One, whether to have space stations for people for just industrial and private use, and the other is the space stations for national security for the warfare state. I'll give homework to some world watcher who wants to call Washington or help me out and find out if William Graham is any way related to Daniel Graham, the head of High Frontier, the partner of Fritz Kraemer in Germany, the man pushing the Star Wars Defense Initiative, the wheels behind this action, the head lobbyist in Washington, D.C., the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The Star Wars Defense and the Defense Intelligence Agency combined together in Daniel Graham, and it would be interesting to know if William Graham, who is replacing James Beggs, is any relation to the other one. Mr. Beggs and Mr. Graham don't speak to each other. Mr. Beggs took a 2-month leave. He was hired in 1981. He worked for General Dynamics up to that time, then went to the space stations and space program to NASA. And now the changes in NASA involve a Mr. Jesse Moore, who just stepped in this week. He's only been there 4 days before the shuttle went down. So there's been a change in the major shift. The heads are all new at the time that this Challenger was going up. This defective shuttle ship was going up, and with warnings about it going up, and they've moved out the person who was in charge. They've indicted the other one who just stepped aside. There's infighting where they don't talk to each other. So there's a shift of personnel, and a lot of the excuses for not answering many of the questions is, we're too new here. They just happened to bring in a new team. And is this team the Warfare Star Wars team to work NASA in conjunction with the Defense Star Wars, moving a lot of their activity now to Vandenberg Air Base in California, not too far from Carmel, $2.8 billion base where they'll fly around the poles and begin their intensive work against the Soviet Union. The eighth reason I'm suspicious of this event was that Richard Perle, a man who works in the State Department, one of the greatest manipulators for, say, World War III, the Star War defense, one of the most violent anti-Russians, who speaks about himself as being a Rasputin. He's an instigator, a manipulator. He had a quotation in the newspaper, interestingly enough, just last week in the White House, and they were talking about the Ronald Reagan's insecurities or decisions and how he makes decisions. And this is a story from the San Jose Mercury, January 28th. Administration is at war with itself, officials say, and it has to do with the simmering George Shultz, Caspar Weinberger battle, their relationships to the Soviet Union, and whether they're going to go along and have disarmament or try to get rid of the atomic bombs, and the warfare going on in the White House. And then the story goes on, Mr. Perle, Assistant Defense Secretary Richard Perle, added with a grin, there's been a lot of infighting. One reason is that the president doesn't give strong direction. He lets every issue ventilate until it bubbles up and forces a decision. Then Perle added with a grin, on the other hand, there hasn't been a disaster, so maybe Reagan's system works. Now that is Tuesday, January 28th, and somebody had to order that ship to go up in that freezing temperature with all the problems of the ice, and I think, and said last week, I think this will be Reagan's disaster, and it comes from a man who could cause it if there were a continuation of the military takeover in this country, not appreciating Mr. Gorbachev coming here or Ronald Reagan trying to understand him, to do just as they did with the U-2 plane over the Soviet Union to embarrass the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, who later began to talk about the military-industrial complex in no uncertain words. So Richard Perle is quoted the very day it went down, saying Reagan has pushed his luck too far. I'm translating it. He hasn't yet had a disaster, and that morning was the disaster. Another point is that even if a bad challenger goes down, if they say we need another one or we'll rebuild another one or push your pennies, it isn't bad for business. Rockwell would get the contract, Theocal would get it, Lockheed would get it. It would cost $2.2 billion. It comes out of our defense budget, which is astronomical. It goes right out of the Air Force or whatever budget, or out of the intelligence budget, which is unlimited. So with it for several years, it's economically good to build a new one. You have a bad one, and the sympathy for the people who went down, this broad spectrum, as I say, that rainbow group that went down, the sympathy is with them, this tremendous buildup. So it's a good way to get the American buckaroos to buy a new ship, keep these people employed. They bought their homes, so they want to keep the payments going. Warfare is business, so what if it went down? Let it go down, take the transfer from the civilian to the military, and give us the money to build a new ship. Another point is that William Graham, who's now head of NASA, knowing that the weather was bad for 3 days, came out on Tuesday. By visiting members of Congress, he wasn't watching the space shuttle take off. He's the new head of NASA, and he was in the offices of a congressman visiting the day it went off. He learned it from him, and he's, campaigning, I guess, already for a new ship. And you would think with the weather hazards and the standoff, should we go or we shouldn't go, and Rockwell saying don't go in that morning, and they delay it 1 hour, and they delayed it another hour, you'd think that the head of NASA himself would be watching this, but according to accounts, he was in the office of a congressman visiting with him at the time the shuttle took off. Another point is that they could be testing, as I said before, the laser, the Star War weapons, because the rocket booster was shot down, and they lied about that, and they could be testing on the ground right away. When the seals didn't hold and the cold weather caused the ship to malfunction, were they testing these laser weapons? The Soviet Union objected to the test at Vandenberg Air Force Base, but this way you could hide part of your Star Wars of breaking up the rocket boosters with lasers and cause them to fall off, and then you could blame the cold weather later on the leak, or you don't have to use the weather. You just say there was a leak and you know it. If those documents were there in July, that they knew there was problems, then test your laser and use it as an ordinary flight, just as Vandenberg had a controversy testing that laser this summer, just at the time of the meeting, or this winter, with Gorbachev and President Reagan. Another point is immediately after the rocket boosters were destroyed, there was a silence for 24 hours, and then NASA said we did it to save the population. It was going to come back to the population. Then another day passes, and they admitted that they were lying. This was in Time magazine. They said it wouldn't come back to the land. I'm not a scientist and never built a spaceship, but I know they don't fly, and it would have fallen in the water. I knew it was a lie. Then they began to cry one day later, we've lost some of our best evidence. Well, they blew it up, and then quickly they went to get all the parts that nobody could see them or get the parts, just as they're getting the cameras from the ordinary photographers who have less information than the rocket boosters. And they scramble around for those parts, and then it turns out that the Air Force was the one who pressed the button and blew up the boosters. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. So there were these lies, one following the other, first silence and then lies. The 13th reason that I think is a conspiracy is the matter of impounding the photographs that I mentioned regarding control of the news media. They said, we know it's illegal, but we're going to keep the film. Is this a police state? I don't have to ask that question. It's been a police state since 1963, but as I say, they're licking up all their not their wounds, but their setbacks, and now they're getting smart. Like Grenada, they won't let you see if they bomb up a hospital where there could be testing, or even for AIDS or medical experiments down in Grenada, and we'll do more on that later. But they impounded the pictures, knowing it was illegal. What was necessary for them to take the film away from those people so soon? Another reason I think something is weird about this is that President Reagan watched the TV from direct lines from the White House. He could have watched from the TV instead of using his direct lines, from the White House. He sat in front of the camera, according to the Washington Post and other stories, and watched like we did, and got his information from the news people just as we get information from the news people. Well, at the time he was shot, the news people said Mr. James Brady was dead, so then the White House thought Brady was dead. But they have direct lines. They don't have to depend on disinformation or wrong information. But I believe that they watch it so that they see what the people are told and can tape what the people are told. And if there's too much discussion of the weather, which there was, if there are too many pictures of the icicle, which there were, and luckily I have those, they haven't taken ours away with the videotapes, then they can counteract the thing that they don't want told quickly by watching what the public hears, not calling directly and finding out for themselves. So another point is that Reagan didn't understand what happened when he was told that this shuttle went down. And many of you saw this quotation in the papers where Mr. Buchanan came in and told him the space shuttle had exploded. And Reagan said, is that the one with the teacher? Well, since 1984, he had talked about the teacher. They had sent, as I say, these 800 newspaper people there. The newspaper was filled with nothing but the teacher. So why would the President of the United States ask if it was the one with the teacher? Was there any other shuttle going off that day? And he's going to talk about the teacher in his speech that evening in the State of the Union. And he'd been planning the speech I read since last summer, if you can believe that. But how is it that Reagan, President of the United States, that day is confused? Was he drugged? Does he get pain pills for the part of his colon that was taken out? Is he sedated at times? How much do we know about the mind of a man who says to Mr. Buchanan, was that the one with the teacher? So would he make decisions? He can't make decisions to fly in the cold, but somebody behind his back, like John Kennedy said, there's a hidden government behind my back, Allen Dulles and John J. McCloy and that gang, somebody, as I say, Air Force or Pentagon beyond Reagan, knowing he would use Christ in the speech and so forth, but he didn't seem to understand, and the Washington Post had a story, and San Jose Mercury, that the president didn't seem to understand what happened and kept on talking about the speech tonight as if it didn't happen. And this is a direct quotation. He didn't seem to understand what had happened. And I think that's very interesting because actually he isn't that stupid, and they had trouble getting into his head the story of what was taking place, and everyone else in the country could pick it up instantly. Another point, number 16, is that NASA knew for 3 days what happened the first day, and they didn't make any effort to explain. There are news articles saying that they understood exactly how it happened, that they're ready to go launch again, that they can take off because the location of the problem has been solved. This was in the San Jose Mercury this last Saturday. The Air Force is pressing it with preparations for the next shuttle, now scheduled for mid-July, after receiving informal advice from NASA officials of the cause of the Challenger explosion has been located. Now, the committee's going on and has 120 days to find out what happened, and NASA says we're ready to launch now because we understand what happened. If you don't think that's a little weird, please explain it to me. They knew within 3 days, another news article said, what happened from the first day, but they didn't make any effort to explain for a few days. Another point is that NASA was supposed to tell the nation within 20 minutes when lives are lost, when there's damage lost. And this is a provision that was put into NASA a few years ago, that they were to tell the American public within a very short time. This was written into their laws, actually, or the rules of NASA, that they were to inform the public right away within 20 minutes, because people would hear it on the radio or they would see it on TV. And yet NASA waited 5 hours and then was evasive about the questions and wouldn't answer them. And the question is, what was the reason for breaking the regulations that within 20 minutes they would announce the facts to people, and many of them already knew them. Another point is that the Air Force was the organization that decided or quickly blew up the rocket boosters. Newsweek, February the 10th, tells you that the Air Force blew up the rocket boosters. And again, that's the piece of machinery that is so controversial, that relates to the seals and the frozen weather and the fuel in the rocket boosters. And the Air Force, the military decision came from the Air Force to blow the rocket boosters. The rocket boosters are important for the evidence to solve this thing, and they lied about having destroyed it themselves. They were the ones that destroyed it, and they lied about the population. Another suspicious thing is the commission that Ronald Reagan appointed. First, NASA was going to investigate it. They're still doing some work. Congress was to investigate it. And this is similar to a body of legal people in the state of Texas that were to investigate the murder of John Kennedy. Then President Lyndon Johnson, who inherited his throne, appointed his commission to investigate it. Now, William Rogers, appointed by the President of the United States to investigate the committee, is a member of Kissinger Associates. Kissinger, of course, is the godson or the person who owes his career to his mentor, Fritz Kraemer. Fritz Kraemer shares the offices with the head of SDI of Star Wars for High Frontier, Daniel Graham. Rogers is a member of Kissinger Associates, and Kissinger and his gang are very close to Star Wars and Air Force, were the people blowing up the rocket boosters. Of first hearing about this event of the explosion, NASA claimed they were ill-prepared to go on television, to see the public, to answer questions, and now they'll be off the air, and then they will cover up what they want and let a little leak, and it will appear to be a full investigation. Another thing I'm suspicious of, also I want to go in, William Rogers, a World Watcher listener, sent me a letter right away and reminded me and called me, if you have the Sundance article by Jeff Gerth, and I'll detail it for those of you who don't have it, he goes into detail of the role of William Rogers of organized crime with Richard Nixon and B.B. Rabosa and Resorts International and their Bahamas and international connections. He was also the attorney for the Shah of Iran, formerly our Attorney General, and worked under Eisenhower and Nixon. Earl Warren, who headed the Warren Commission, was an old link to the mobsters, to Murray Chotiner, to the crime syndicate in California and New York with Tom Dewey and Lucky Luciano gang. So they have a man closely related to the crime syndicate with no knowledge of space shuttles or spaceships, but a familiarity with how to cover up events similar to this in other occasions. William Rogers heads the committee. The commission appointed him. He's the head appointed by Ronald Reagan. Another reason I'm suspicious of is that what held up the shuttle the second hour, the first hour is when Rockwell came out and said, don't go. We're talking about Tuesday, and I mentioned last week how I woke up and heard it had been delayed 1 hour because of the ice, and the ice never dropped or changed. But what held up the shuttle the second hour, according to the Washington Post, January 29th, was detection that an electronic fire detection system on the launch pad, heating a faulty computer card, began spewing inaccurate readings. It is supposed to ensure that the fire suppression system is functioning on the launch pad. It was repaired 1 hour before launch on Tuesday. It was not detected for 5 days, or they didn't describe it for 5 days. Why not? So, 1, the ice held them up 1 hour. 2, a warning on fire held them up the second hour. 3, they went off when the ice was the same. I wonder if the warning system of the fire was really repaired that second hour. So they went out with the ice the same condition as it was when they weren't supposed to go, and worked on a fire warning system for an hour, then launched. Another point is that brought out in Newsweek that accidental damage took place. Many of you know this. The derrick on launch pad 39B, the tower struck one of the attach points between the Challenger and the external fuel tank. NASA Chief Jesse Moore dismissed it as a minor scrape. Then later, he admitted that he didn't bother to attempt to X-ray the underlying metal for structural damage. Again, this is number 21 in the reasons I believe the ship was sabotaged and never meant to fly by the military defense, the Air Force blowing up the booster rockets, knowing the SEALs were bad, and taking space literally into the hands of the military from now on. Another reason I believe it was sabotage, point 22, is the change of responsibility for the orders to launch. The Wall Street Journal, February the 4th, 1986, said the first few days, Jesse Moore took responsibility along with a team of giving approval to launch. Wall Street Journal, that's my comment. The early days, starting the minute the ship went down, actually January the 28th, Jesse Moore took credit, or took the blame, not the credit, the blame for the launch. He said, I gave them the go-ahead, along with a group of teams that helped make the thing. I gave them the go-ahead, and Moore had just been there 4 days with the NASA in this capacity when he gave the go-ahead. But in Newsweek, Wall Street Journal rather, February the 4th, it says Rockwell International urged NASA against proceeding. But quoting Jesse Moore on February the 4th, he said, but others involved in the decision basically recommended that, we launch. He's the shuttle program director. Sunday, he said, before the launch, and remember the quote I had last week, I will not be pressured because of the schedule. That's the Defense Department schedule to get the Star Wars operations going. I will not be pressured because of the schedule, which, as I say, is a military operation. If he wouldn't be pressured because of the schedule, then why, this is on Sunday, then why on Tuesday did he say that others involved in the proceedings, in the decision, recommended we go? Another point is that Judson A. Lovingood, the man that I quoted before, the deputy manager of shuttle projects in Huntsville, Alabama, the nest work of Werner von Braun and Mr. Rudolph and the top Nazis that came over from Germany for Star Wars, for space stations, for the attack of World War III. Mr. Lovingood from Huntsville, Alabama, was told by Theocol, who makes the boosters, in quotes, that cold temperature is okay. It will not be affected by the fuel. And Rockwell, who made the shuttle, called to say that cold weather was a danger. Don't go. If cold weather causes or delays in other ships before, if there's other reasons to fear the ice or icicles other than fuel, and this is the SEALs, then why were they cautious before and not cautious on the 28th? The Huntsville characters, the Star Wars characters, the Project Paperclip nest, did they have more to say than Rockwell? Of course they did. San Jose Mercury, February 7th, 1986, said that Thea Cole, who makes the boosters from Huntsville, where they were quoted, "Cold is okay, won't affect the fuel." Rockwell calls and says, "It's a danger, don't go." And they went. And they knew that they couldn't fly in this, or take off in this kind of weather. Another reason that I believe this is suspicious is that NASA failed to communicate the disaster. William Safire, January 30th, 1986, has a syndicated column that the NASA Public Affairs Division contingency plan, and this is the one I was naming before, dated March the 30th, 1984, reads, "In the event of an emergency involving crew injury or fatality, the fact will be apparent to radio listeners and TV viewers. Status of the crew will be the prime public consideration. The facts, once confirmed, should be announced as promptly as possible. No longer than 20 minutes should lapse before an announcement is made." That was put into their rules at NASA, March 30th, 1984. The other point I said was that NASA waited 5 hours to have a press conference, and this is the fact that it was specified that they should go out and tell you. So why did they take so long? NASA was busy, according to William Safire, for 5 hours, dealing with inexperienced boss, but the man in charge should be there. NASA was not ready for the public side of their contingency. Another point about the Air Force, number 25, is from the San Jose Mercury, February the 8th. They were ready to go again with the Discovery a while back when they received advice from NASA on the cause of the explosion. 2 weeks later, the Air Force blew up a rocket booster, as I say, then lied about that. They said it's not as serious as we thought. We have incorporated deficiencies, and we will be using the new solid fuel boosters. They were ready to go with the new kind of fuel anyway. The Air Force and the SDI were going to Vandenberg, and they would be using a new fuel in the Discovery. So the Challenger was outdated anyway. The Challenger was going with possibly frozen fuel in the lowest temperature they've ever taken off. And the quotation of the people involved with Vandenberg and so forth said that they've corrected the deficiencies that the Challenger went out with. We won't be using that fuel. We have 2 new solid rocket boosters with wound filament around them rather than steel. It'll save them 4,600 pounds. The launch will take place in California. It will carry Teal Ruby. That will be the satellite to fly over the poles and over the Soviet Union. And they even went so far as to say we shouldn't rebuild the new shuttle. So they knew it was bad. They're ready with the new one, and they have a different kind of fuel. So they could, again, test their laser, put the rocket booster deep sixth, and test their laser because they already have something else to come up with. Now, another reason I'm suspicious is that besides gathering the film of the explosion, they know they're breaking the law. There has to be a military operation involved in this. Now, Judith Resnick, who went down with this shuttle, the Challenger, was doing experiments on AIDS, and I'll do more about that with you next week. And next week I'm going to talk about the Challenger and its relation to the KAL, and also do more, of course, on advanced genetic sciences. I don't want to leave that behind. But NASA seized this film, and they wouldn't have to do this unless it were a military operation. The military are saying, don't worry, we have new fuel now, that's okay. They're saying, don't worry, you don't have to build another shuttle. And they're saying, don't worry if we break a law and it's illegal to take your film, because they might have tested blowing up that booster by remote control the way they did the other satellite. They have the technology. There's pictures of the icicles there, and the taking of the news cameras away and the films, as I read you the article, is dangerous. Impounding it is dangerous. It's illegal. It's a bad precedent, and hopefully the news media, after being knocked down after Grenada and coming back like pussycats, maybe they'll understand what is really happening here. Now, another point I'm suspicious about is the shuttle contingency plan. Dr. Hans Mark, with a long history of working with the former Nazis, I can't remember, I'll have to look up his biography of if he came from here, Germany, to this country from paperclip. I believe he did. I have to check out his background. Dr. Hans Mark was deputy administrator for NASA. He was former secretary of the Air Force, and the Air Force, as I say, are the ones saying, we have the other fuel, don't build another ship, we blew up the boosters. He said all vital military payloads would be clearly flown because military missions had priority. He said that even though the contingency plan is that if one shuttle goes down and we lose one or two, the military gets the priority. The Air Force and the military have to take over from NASA priorities into their hands. The shuttle explosion, I believe, provided the excuse to destroy booster rockets that concealed what happened, the role of the ice, which they totally have ruled out. And then finally, there's a long article in the Chicago Tribune and the San Francisco Examiner, February the 5th. The solid fuel temperature was not checked by NASA. NASA officials admitted that the temperature inside the booster rockets was not checked before the launch. They never considered monitoring the cold fuel package. This is Jim Mizell from NASA. I don't remember any discussion about temperature of the solids. Solid fuel deteriorates in some sub-freezing weather. The flames can get as hot as 6,000 and reach and burn through the booster casings. A burn-through is believed to be the cause of the explosion. NASA has refused to release record of temperature at launch site the hours before launch, but they've impounded the information, but the Weather Service said was 23 degrees in the early morning hours, and after the explosion it was 28 degrees. You see how childish they are. The weather is public knowledge to everybody. They say we have impounded what the weather was that day. I don't have time to finish this article that was in the Chicago Tribune and the Examiner out here, but I think you get the idea from this broadcast and from what I said last week that I believe that the Challenger was sabotaged. It had to come from the Pentagon, the Star Wars people. The ship was useless. It was broken down anyway in many areas. They sacrificed a lot, and what they gained was now the military control of space, the solidification of the military taking over the space shuttle, and that's what I think this was all about. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week to talk about some more of these very important events.